The air in the conference room was cold, the kind of artificial chill that smells like expensive furniture polish and impending doom. Across the mahogany table, Vincent Mercer sat like a king on a temporary throne. He was wearing a $3,000 suit I had picked out for him last Christmas, leaning back with that practiced look of bored superiority. He didn't just want the divorce. He wanted the spectacle of my defeat. He wanted to see me break, to see the loyal little wife finally crumble under the weight of his success. His lawyer, Harold Whitfield, was busy shuffling papers with the rhythmic, soul-crushing sound of a man who got paid by the hour to ruin lives. Vincent caught my eye and smirked, a tiny, sharp expression that said, "I won, Alexis. I took it all, and there's nothing you can do about it." But then, the atmosphere shifted. Harold paused, his hand hovering over a specific blue folder. He leaned in toward Vincent, his face suddenly drained of its professional confidence. He whispered 5 words, just 5. I couldn't hear them, but I saw the exact second they hit home. Vincent's face, that smug, self-satisfied face I'd stared at across the breakfast table for 15 years, went completely white. It wasn't just a loss of color. It was as if his entire identity had been erased in a heartbeat. His hands, which had been so steady while he prepared to sign away my future, started trembling. The papers he'd been so eager to finalize began shaking like leaves in a gale. And me? For the first time in 3 long, agonizing years, I let a smile touch my lips. Not a big, triumphant grin, but a slow, cold realization of victory. But to understand why a man who thought he owned the world was suddenly terrified of a woman he'd discarded like trash, you have to understand the long game. You have to understand how a woman everyone thought had lost her mind was actually the only person in the room who knew the truth. My name is Alexis Dunst. I'm 34 years old, and until 90 days ago, I was the invisible engine behind the Mercer real estate empire. 15 years of marriage is a lifetime when you're spending it building someone else's monument. I met Vincent when I was just 17, a girl who graduated high school early not because of a genius IQ, but because of a desperate, burning need for independence. I was practical, motivated, and tired of being a background character in my own life. I started as a file clerk at Henderson and Price law firm. It was minimum wage and maximum paper cuts, but it was my kingdom. By 18, I was a legal assistant. I learned the language of the law, the loopholes, the fine print, the way a single comma can change the fate of a multi-million-dollar contract. I learned to keep my mouth shut and my eyes wide open. Vincent was 24 when our paths crossed at a client gala. He was the sun, and everyone else was just a planet caught in his gravity. He talked about empires and legacies as if he were reciting history instead of dreaming. He was charming, yes, but it was his ambition that hooked me. He looked at the world and saw a map he was destined to conquer. I looked at the world and saw the logistics required to make that conquest possible. When he told me he was going to build something incredible, I didn't just swoon. I told him I'd help him file the articles of incorporation. It wasn't the most romantic start, but it was a partnership, or so I thought. We were married by the time I was 19. Our son, Tyler, arrived a year later. Those early years were a blur of caffeine, diapers, and spreadsheets. I stayed at the law firm part-time, obsessively building my 401k and tucking away every spare cent. My grandmother, a woman who had survived the Great Depression with nothing but her wits and a hidden tin of coins, always told me that a woman should have her own money. Not secret money, she'd say while kneading bread dough, just your own, something nobody can take when the world gets loud. I took that to heart. When Vincent's business finally exploded when I was 23, he asked me to leave the firm. He needed someone he could trust completely to handle the books, the contractors, and the chaos. I became his unpaid everything. For 11 years, I was the ghost in the machine. I was the bookkeeper who found the missing margins, the office manager who settled the disputes, the interior decorator who made his model homes look like dreams, and the marketing coordinator who polished his public image. My official title was wife, a word that Vincent eventually started using as a synonym for employee who doesn't require a paycheck. At industry events, I stood 2 steps behind him, the silent supporter. He would stand on stages accepting awards for Visionary of the Year, thanking his mentors and his incredible team. But he never quite found the breath to mention the woman who had stayed up until 3 a.m., reconciling his accounts so he wouldn't get audited. The shift happened slowly, like a leak in a basement that you don't notice until the foundation starts to rot. He stopped asking for my opinion on acquisitions. He started working late, returning home smelling of expensive scotch and a perfume that definitely wasn't mine. Then came the criticism. It started with the way I dressed. Too corporate, he'd say, or not trendy enough for the image we're projecting. Then it was the meals, then my lack of ambition. I remember standing in our designer kitchen, staring at him while he complained that I wasn't growing with him. I was running his entire back office, raising our teenage son, and keeping his life from spinning into a ditch. But to him, I was stagnant. The bomb didn't drop with a bang. It dropped with a Tuesday evening dinner. I had made his favorite, lamb with rosemary, because I was still trying, still hoping that if I was the perfect wife, the man I married would come back. He sat down, pushed his plate aside, and looked at me with the cold, detached eyes of a CEO firing a mid-level manager. "I want a divorce," he said. No preamble. No, "I'm sorry." Just a list of demands. He wanted the house, the luxury cars, the business, and the reputation. "You can keep Tyler," he added, as if he were graciously letting me keep a piece of old furniture that didn't fit his new aesthetic. He wanted the assets. He wanted to hold the child. He viewed our 15-year-old son as a leftover, an inconvenience he was willing to let me handle so he could start his new chapter unencumbered. What Vincent didn't realize as he sat there, feeling powerful between the salt shaker and the butter dish, was that he had made a fatal mistake. He assumed that because I was quiet, I was blind. He assumed that because I was loyal, I was stupid. But I had spent years in a law firm, and 3 years ago I had stumbled upon a digital trail of breadcrumbs in his private ledger that led to a very dark forest. I had been waiting for the right moment to strike, but I hadn't expected him to hand me the match first. As he walked out of the kitchen that night to call his high-priced lawyer, Harold Whitfield, I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I just cleared the table and started thinking about the 5 words that would eventually turn his world to ash. The days following Vincent's announcement felt like a slow-motion home invasion. Only the intruder was the man I had shared a bed with for 15 years. He didn't just want me out of his life. He wanted to erase the fact that I had ever been a part of it. Within 48 hours, the master bedroom was off-limits. I was relegated to the guest room, a space usually reserved for distant relatives and the occasional holiday visitor. It was a cold, sterile room at the end of the hall, and as I dragged my suitcase across the hardwood floors, I realized this was his way of testing my boundaries. He wanted to see if I would scream, if I would break a vase, or if I would beg for mercy. I did none of those things. I simply closed the door and began to organize my thoughts. I wasn't just hiding. I was observing. By the second week, the new chapter had a name and a face: Brittany Sawyer. She was 27, a marketing assistant at Vincent's firm, and the living embodiment of every midlife crisis cliché ever written. She walked into my kitchen on a Thursday afternoon as if she had already signed the deed to the house. She had that Instagram-perfect veneer, blonde highlights that caught the light just right, a perpetual yoga glow, and an air of unearned confidence. She didn't just enter my home, she occupied it. I watched from the hallway as she opened my cabinets, looking for a blender. She found my grandmother's apron, the one with the faded flower stains and the hand-stitched hem, and tied it around her waist without a second thought. She was younger than my marriage, younger than my favorite vintage handbag, yet there she was, making kale smoothies in the heart of my life. Vincent paraded her around like a trophy won at a prestigious auction. They would sit on the Italian leather sofa I had spent 3 months sourcing, watching the television I had bought for his birthday, eating off the bone china we had received as wedding gifts. He would drape his arm around her shoulders right in front of me, his eyes never meeting mine, as if I had become part of the wallpaper. It was a calculated humiliation. He wanted me to feel small, to feel replaced, to feel like a relic of a past he had outgrown. But every time Brittany laughed at one of his mediocre jokes, I reminded myself that she was only seeing the glitter. She had no idea she was standing on a sinkhole. Then came the financial strangulation. It started with a notification on my phone. My personal credit card had been declined. When I confronted Vincent, he didn't even look up from his tablet. "We need to separate our finances, Alexis," he said, his voice smooth and devoid of any history. "It's only fair. You can't expect me to subsidize your lifestyle while we're in the middle of a legal separation." 2 days later, the joint accounts were frozen. I was effectively locked out of the empire I had helped build. He was trying to starve me out, hoping that a lack of resources would force me to sign whatever predatory settlement Harold Whitfield threw my way. If Vincent was the hammer, his mother Lorraine was the anvil. She showed up with her perfectly coiffed silver hair and a suitcase full of judgment. Lorraine had always viewed me as a temporary fixture, a working-class girl who had gotten lucky. She sat me down and patted my hand with a touch that felt like ice. "Men have needs, dear," she whispered, as if she were revealing a deep, ancient secret. Perhaps if you had focused more on being a wife and less on being a bookkeeper, Vincent wouldn't have looked elsewhere. You really should have tried harder to keep him happy. This was coming from a woman whose own husband spent 7 days a week at the country club, specifically to avoid her company. But in Lorraine's world, the failure of a marriage was always the woman's cross to bear. Lorraine didn't just come to offer advice, she came to pack. She went through my belongings with the clinical efficiency of a liquidator. She decided what I deserved to keep. My old clothes were tossed into black garbage bags, not boxes, but heavy-duty trash bags, as if I were refuse being cleared away. She hesitated over my grandmother's recipe box, her fingers tracing the worn wood. I saw the greed in her eyes, the desire to claim even the smallest pieces of my heritage. I stood my ground on that one, my voice cold and steady. "Touch that box, Lorraine, and the lawyers will be the least of your problems." She pulled back, startled by the sudden steel in my tone, but the damage was done. By the end of the day, my 15 years of life were reduced to 10 plastic bags sitting in the hallway. In the midst of this wreckage, I thought I had a sanctuary. Diane Holloway had been my best friend for 20 years. We had survived high school, heartbreaks, and the early, lean years of our 20s together. She was the person I called when the world felt too heavy. She would come over with bottles of wine, let me sob on her shoulder, and tell me that Vincent was a fool who would regret everything. She encouraged me to tell her every detail of my legal strategy. "What did your lawyer say? Are you going to fight for the house? Where are you planning to move?" I told her everything, trusting her with the raw, bleeding edges of my plan. But then, the coincidences became too frequent to ignore. I mentioned to Diane that I was thinking about contesting the business valuation. The next day, Vincent made a comment about how pointless it is to challenge experts. I told Diane I was looking at a specific apartment complex. Tyler came home saying his dad thought that neighborhood was trashy. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I started looking back at the last decade with new eyes. I saw the way Diane's face lit up when Vincent walked into a room. I remembered the way she would defend him during our girls' nights, subtly suggesting that maybe I was being too hard on him. Diane wasn't just my friend, she was Vincent's spy. She had been carrying a torch for him since our wedding day, and Vincent, the master manipulator, had used that crush to turn her into his eyes and ears. He had probably promised her a future once I was gone, dangling the carrot of his wealth and status to keep her loyal. She was selling out 20 years of sisterhood for the crumbs of a man who would never actually respect her. It was a special kind of pain, to realize that while I was grieving my marriage, my best friend was auditioning for my replacement. The most agonizing part, however, wasn't the mistress or the traitorous friend. It was Tyler. My 15-year-old son was being caught in the crossfire, and Vincent was using him as a human shield. Every night I could hear them in the living room. Vincent's voice was low, paternal, and laced with poison. "Your mother is making this so difficult, Ty. I just want us all to be happy, but she's being vindictive. I'm trying to be fair, but she won't cooperate." He was painting me as the villain of the story, the bitter woman standing in the way of his happiness. Tyler started pulling away. He wouldn't look me in the eye. He stopped coming to me with his problems, preferring to retreat into his room. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of betrayal. My husband, my mother-in-law, my best friend, they were all aligned against me. To the outside world, I was a defeated woman, a victim of a powerful man's whim. Even my lawyer, Nina Castellano, looked at me with pity when I told her I didn't want to fight him in the traditional way. She thought I was broken. She thought I was giving up. She had no idea that I was just clearing the board. Because while they were all busy playing checkers, I had already won the game of chess 3 years ago. I just needed them to think I was powerless a little while longer. The secret didn't announce itself with a trumpet blast. It arrived in the middle of a rainy Tuesday night, 3 years before the divorce papers ever touched my skin. At the time, I was still the devoted partner, the woman who believed that if I worked hard enough, I could earn the love of a man who was increasingly treating me like a piece of office equipment. Vincent was at a late-night networking event, a phrase that I had already begun to suspect was code for something else. I was sitting in our home office, the blue light of the monitor reflecting off my glasses, surrounded by a mountain of receipts and digital statements. I was doing what I always did, finding the money he didn't know he'd lost. Because I had been a legal assistant, I was obsessed with reconciliation. I didn't just look at the totals, I looked at the origins. That night, I was tracing a minor discrepancy in a contractor's invoice for a luxury development project called the Mercer Heights. It was a $500 error, something most people would ignore, but my brain wouldn't let it go. As I dug deeper into the wire transfer history, I found a ghost. A recurring payment of $15,000, categorized under miscellaneous consulting fees, sent to an entity called VM Strategic Holdings, LLC. My pulse quickened. I knew every subsidiary of the Mercer Empire. I had filed the paperwork for all of them. But I had never heard of VM Strategic Holdings. I spent the next 6 hours descending into a digital rabbit hole. Using the skills I'd honed at my old law firm, I accessed the public records of the LLC's incorporation. It had been filed in a different state, one with strict privacy laws, but the registered agent was a familiar name, a college friend of Vincent's who specialized in offshore accounts and wealth protection. My husband wasn't just building a real estate empire, he was building a trapdoor. He was siphoning off marital assets, hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years, and funneling them into an account I wasn't supposed to know existed. He was preparing for a life without me long before he had the courage to say the words out loud. In that moment, standing in the silence of our $1-million home, the woman I used to be died. The Alexis who hoped for a happily ever after was replaced by the Alexis who had spent her teens filing lawsuits. I didn't scream. I didn't call him. I didn't even cry.
Instead, I opened a fresh, encrypted spreadsheet. I titled it The Garden because I was going to plant seeds, and I was going to wait for them to grow. I realized that if I confronted him then, he would simply hide the money better. He had the expensive lawyers, the charisma, and the power. If I divorced him 3 years ago, I would have walked away with half of what was on the books, which was already being depleted by his secret transfers. To win, I had to be more than a wife. I had to be a ghost. I had to let him believe he was smarter than me. I had to let him believe I was the unambitious woman he criticized at dinner parties. The next 3 years were a masterclass in psychological camouflage. I continued to work as his bookkeeper, but I stopped correcting the errors that favored my secret records. Every time he moved money into his hidden LLC, I made a digital copy of the transaction, the timestamp, and the IP address it originated from. I tracked his correspondence. I learned that VM Strategic Holdings wasn't just a savings account. It was being used to purchase property in his name only, assets he intended to claim as separate property during a future divorce by claiming they were bought with premarital or gifted funds. I watched him grow more arrogant. He became careless because he thought I was blinded by my own loyalty. When he started his affair with Brittany, I didn't find out through a stray hair or a lipstick stain. I found out through a credit card statement for a boutique hotel in the city. I looked at the date, looked at the price, And then I went to the kitchen and made him his favorite dinner. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. To sit across from a man who was betraying me in every possible way and ask him how his day was. But every bite of steak he took was a win for me. Every day he stayed married to me was another day I gathered more evidence of his financial fraud. I also began my own separate preparation. I didn't just save money. I invested in myself in ways he couldn't see. I maintained my ties with the senior partners at my old law firm. I did favors for them, research, document review, keeping my legal mind sharp. I made sure they knew exactly what I was doing and why. I was building an army of witnesses who would one day testify that I was the primary operator of the Mercer business. I even managed the situation with Diane. When I realized she was spying for him, I didn't cut her off. That would have alerted Vincent that I was on to him. Instead, I used her as a funnel for misinformation. I would confide in her that I was terrified of being poor, or that I didn't understand how the business worked anymore. I fed her stories of my depression and confusion. She, in turn, fed them to Vincent. It made him feel powerful. It made him feel like he was winning a war I wasn't even fighting. The most difficult part of the long game was Tyler. I had to watch my son grow up in a house where his father was a king and his mother was a servant. I had to bite my tongue when Vincent lectured Tyler on strength and taking what you want. I wanted to tell my son the truth, but I knew that at 14 or 15, he couldn't carry that burden. He needed to see the truth for himself. I had to trust that the foundation I had built for him, the kindness, the integrity, would hold even when his father tried to blow the house down. By the time that Tuesday night 3 months ago arrived, the night Vincent finally asked for the divorce, I wasn't surprised. I was relieved. The 3 years of acting, the 3 years of being a ghost in my own life were finally over. When he told me he wanted everything, I had to suppress a laugh. He thought he was taking a kingdom from a peasant. He had no idea he was a man standing on a carpet, and I was the one holding the edge, ready to pull. I hired Nina Castellano because I knew how she looked to men like Vincent, a shark who would fight for a standard 50-50 split. I wanted Vincent to focus on Nina. I wanted him to spend all his energy fighting her in the foreground, while I worked in the shadows. Nina thought I was giving up because I told her to let him have the house for now. I told her to let him keep the cars. I told her to let him think he was winning the asset battle. Alexis, you're being too soft, Nina had barked at me in our first meeting. He's going to strip you bare. I had leaned across her desk, my eyes colder than she had ever seen them. Nina, let him take the house. Let him take the business. I don't want the crumbs. I want the bakery. And I'm going to get it because Vincent Mercer has been committing felony tax evasion and interstate wire fraud for 36 months. And I have every single receipt. Now, back in that cold conference room, as Harold Whitfield whispered those 5 words to my husband, I knew the trap had finally snapped shut. Vincent's face wasn't just white from the divorce. It was white because he finally realized that the unambitious woman he'd married wasn't his victim. She was his executioner. The silence in the room was no longer professional. It was heavy, suffocating, and charged with the kind of electricity that precedes a lightning strike. Vincent's lawyer, Harold, hadn't just whispered. He had breathed a death sentence into the ear of his client. Those 5 words, the ones that had turned Vincent's blood to ice water, were simple direct and utterly devastating. The forensic audit is internal. To anyone else, those words might have sounded like dry accounting jargon. To Vincent, they were a notification that the walls were closing in. In his arrogance, he had assumed that any audit would be conducted by a third party, someone he could potentially influence, stall, or mislead with a labyrinth of shell companies. But an internal audit meant that the paper trail I had meticulously reconstructed over the last 3 years had been verified by the very people who managed his legitimate payroll. It meant the ghost in the machine had finally spoken. Vincent's hands were no longer just trembling. They were visibly shaking. He looked down at the settlement agreement, the document designed to leave me with a small alimony check and a pat on the head, and he saw it for what it was, a confession. He looked at me, his eyes wide and frantic, searching for the submissive woman he thought he knew. He was looking for the Alexis who used to apologize for the coffee being too cold, but that woman didn't exist anymore. I sat there, my spine straight, my expression as unreadable as a blank ledger. I was no longer his wife or his bookkeeper. I was the person who held the keys to his prison cell. "Harold," Vincent croaked, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "There must be a mistake. The accounts, the VM holdings, those are private. They aren't part of this discovery." Harold Whitfield didn't look at his client. He looked at my lawyer, Nina, and then he looked at the blue folder I had placed on the table. "Vincent," Harold said, his voice dropping an octave, "they aren't private anymore. They've been linked to the primary business accounts. Every transfer, every offshore wire, every consulting fee you paid to yourself. It's all here. And it's not just a divorce issue anymore. This is a criminal referral waiting to happen." I saw the moment the realization hit him. He had spent years thinking I was a passive observer of his greatness. He thought I was too unambitious to understand the complexities of high finance fraud. He had underestimated me so thoroughly that he had essentially left the door to his vault wide open while I was the one holding the flashlight. He had forgotten that I was the one who taught him how to file his first tax return. He had forgotten that before I was his wife, I was a legal assistant who spent 10 hours a day finding the lies hidden in the truth. The room seemed to shrink. Nina Castellano, sensing the kill, leaned forward. She didn't look like a shark anymore. She looked like an architect admiring a finished building. "Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel, "my client isn't interested in your apologies. She isn't interested in your new chapter or your girlfriend's smoothies. What she is interested in is the full restoration of the marital estate, including the $4 million you funneled into out-of-state properties over the last 36 months. Vincent turned his gaze toward me, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You did this," he hissed. "You've been spying on me? In our own home? For 3 years?" "I wasn't spying, Vincent," I said, my voice calm and low. It was the first time I had spoken since the meeting began, and the sound of my own confidence felt like a luxury. "I was doing the books, just like you asked. You told me you needed someone you could trust completely. I just didn't realize you were the person I needed to protect the business from." "You're a snake," he spat, leaning across the table. "You sat there every night, eating dinner with me, watching movies with our son, all while you were planning to ruin me." I didn't flinch. I let his anger wash over me. I sat there every night while you planned to leave me with nothing, I countered. I sat there while you brought a 27-year-old into my kitchen to wear my grandmother's apron. I sat there while your mother packed my life into garbage bags. You didn't just want a divorce, Vincent. You wanted to erase me. But you forgot one thing. You can't erase the person who knows where all the bodies are buried. Harold Whitfield sighed, a long, weary sound of a man who knew he was beaten. He pulled his chair closer to Vincent and spoke in a low, urgent tone. Vincent, shut up. Not another word. If this goes to trial, the IRS will be the first ones in the gallery. You aren't just looking at losing the house and the business. You're looking at a federal indictment for tax evasion and money laundering. You need to listen to their terms. Now. The power dynamic in the room had flipped so violently that I could almost feel the floor tilting. The man who had sat me down at the kitchen table 3 months ago to order from a menu was now staring at a bill he couldn't afford to pay. He looked at the papers, then back at me. I saw the gears turning in his head, the desperate search for a way out, a loophole, a lie he hadn't told yet. But there were no more lies left. Every exit was blocked. "What do you want?" Vincent asked, the fight finally draining out of him. He looked old. For the first time, I noticed the gray in his hair that he usually dyed, the fine lines of stress around his eyes that his arrogance usually masked. I looked at Nina, and she slid a new document across the table. It wasn't a settlement agreement. It was a total surrender. "I want the business," I said. "Not half, all of it. I want the house, and I want you out by the end of the week. I want the accounts you thought you hid, and I want a formal, written apology to our son for the lies you've been telling him." "You're insane," Vincent whispered. "I built that company. It's my name on the door." "And it's my brain in the ledger," I replied. "You can keep your name, Vincent. You can even keep Brittany and your mother's advice. But the empire? The empire belongs to the person who actually knows how it works." As I watched him stare at the pen in his hand, I realized that the longest game wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about the house. It was about the moment he realized that the woman he thought was nothing was actually the only thing that had been keeping him whole. He had discarded me because he thought I was a liability. He was about to find out that without me, he was just a man in an expensive suit with a very long list of debts to pay. Walking out of that law firm was like breathing for the first time after being underwater for 3 years. The city air felt crisp, and the weight that had been pressing down on my chest had shifted onto Vincent's. But the legal victory was only the beginning. The long game wasn't finished until the rot was cleared out of every corner of my life. I had reclaimed my future in that conference room, but I still had a house to reclaim, a son to heal, and a traitor to confront. I didn't go back to my cramped apartment. I went straight to the house, the Mercer estate. I used my key, the one Vincent had tried to make me feel guilty for keeping. The house smelled of expensive candles and Brittany's green smoothies. It felt like a museum dedicated to a life that was already dead. I walked into the kitchen and found Diane sitting at the island, sipping a glass of wine. She looked startled to see me, her eyes darting to the door as if expecting Vincent to follow me in and protect her. "Alexis, I didn't expect you here," she said, her voice hitting that high, performative pitch of artificial sympathy. "I was just checking on things for Vincent. He's been so stressed with the meetings today. How did it go? Did you guys finally settle?" I walked over to the counter and poured myself a glass of water, taking my time. I looked at Diane, the woman who had stood by me at the altar. the woman who had held my hand when Tyler was born. I looked at her and wondered how much of our 20-year friendship had been real and how much had been an audition for the role of Vincent's second wife. "It went exactly as I planned, Diane," I said, leaning against the marble countertop. "But then again, you already knew the plan, didn't you? Or at least, you knew the version of the plan I wanted Vincent to hear." Diane's smile faltered. She tried to maintain the mask, but the edges were curling. "I don't know what you mean, Lex. I've been on your side this whole time. I told you, he's making a mistake." "Stop," I said, the word cutting through her lie like a blade. "I know about the calls, Diane. I know about the girls' nights where you'd leave my house and go straight to his office to tell him exactly what I was thinking. I know you've been hoping that once I was cleared out of the way, there would be a vacancy you could fill. You didn't just betray me. You were cheap about it. You sold 20 years of history for the hope of a man who doesn't even know your favorite color." The silence that followed was heavy. Diane's face shifted from concerned friend to something sharper, uglier. She set the wine glass down with a definitive clack. "You were always so superior, Alexis. Even when we were kids. The smart one. The organized one. You didn't deserve him. You turned into a boring suburban drone while he was out there building a world. He needed someone who appreciated his fire, not someone who treated him like a balance sheet." "He didn't build a world, Diane," I said softly. "He built a facade, and you're about to find out how cold it gets when the heating gets turned off." I pulled a small envelope from my bag and slid it across the counter. "This is a trespass notice. As of an hour ago, I am the sole person authorized to be on this property. If you aren't out of this house in 10 minutes, I'm calling the police. And Diane, don't bother calling Vincent. He's currently busy trying to figure out how to stay out of federal prison. I don't think he's going to have time to help you pack." Watching her scramble was less satisfying than I expected. It just felt like taking out the trash. She grabbed her designer bag, one I knew Vincent had bought her as a bonus for her spying, and practically ran to the door. As she left, the house felt lighter. One ghost down, many more to go. Next came the hardest part, Tyler. He was at his father's office, probably being fed more lies about how I was destroying the family. I drove there, not to cause a scene, but to end one. I walked into the lobby of Mercer Real Estate, the glass and steel monument to Vincent's ego. The staff looked at me with a mix of pity and confusion. They had all seen Brittany walking around like the new queen. They thought I was the ghost of a failed marriage. I walked straight past the receptionist and into Vincent's private office. He was sitting there with his head in his hands. Brittany was standing behind him, rubbing his shoulders, whispering something about getting through this together. When she saw me, she stiffened, her youthful confidence evaporating in the face of my absolute lack of emotion. "Alexis, get out," Vincent groaned, not even looking up. "You've had your fun today. Leave us alone." "I'm here for my son, Vincent," I said. "And I'm here to tell Brittany that she should probably start looking for a new job and a new apartment. The company accounts have been frozen pending the restructuring. That includes the marketing budget that pays for her salary and that Tesla she's been driving." Brittany's eyes went wide. "What? Vincent, what is she talking about?" Vincent didn't answer. He couldn't. He was a broken man, staring at the ruins of a kingdom that was never really his. I looked at Brittany, truly looked at her, and felt a flicker of genuine pity. She was just another asset he'd acquired to make himself feel powerful. He didn't tell you, did he? He's not a mogul, Brittany. He's a middleman who forgot to pay his taxes and stole from his own wife. The luxury you've been enjoying? That was my retirement fund, and I'm taking it back. I turned to the door where Tyler was standing. He had been in the break room and had heard the last few minutes of the exchange. His face was a mask of confusion and hurt. He looked at his father, then at the crying woman in the corner, and then at me. "Mom?" he whispered. "Come on, Ty," I said, reaching out my hand. "We're going home. The real home. The one where we don't have to pretend anymore." For the first time in months, Tyler didn't pull away. He walked toward me, leaving the glass office and the trembling man behind. As we walked to the car, I felt the shift. The patient wife was gone. The victim was gone. In their place was a woman who had realized that loyalty without respect is just a slow form of suicide. That night, as Tyler and I sat in our old living room, the one Lorraine had tried to strip bare, I didn't feel like I had won a divorce. I felt like I had performed an exorcism. I looked at the piles of garbage bags in the hallway, the ones filled with my life. I didn't unpack them. I went to the garage, grabbed a lighter, and walked out to the fire pit in the backyard. One by one, I burned the things Lorraine had decided I was allowed to keep. The old frumpy sweaters, the photos of Vincent and me where I was looking at him like he was a god, the wife persona. As the flames rose into the night sky, I realized that the 5 words the lawyer whispered were just the spark. I was the fire. And I was just getting warmed up. The morning after the fire in the backyard, I didn't wake up as a divorcee. I woke up as a CEO. For 15 years, I had dressed in the shadows, choosing muted tones and practical fabrics that wouldn't draw attention away from Vincent's peacocking. But that morning, I pulled a sharp, charcoal gray power suit from the back of the closet. A suit I'd bought in secret months ago. I did my hair with a precision that felt like sharpening a weapon. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the file clerk or the unambitious wife. I saw the woman who had kept a multi-million-dollar empire afloat while its captain was busy playing pretend. I arrived at the Mercer Real Estate headquarters at 8:45 a.m. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of panic. Rumors of the frozen accounts and the internal audit had spread through the office like a fever. The staff were huddled in small groups, whispering near the espresso machine, eyes darting toward Vincent's empty office. They expected a collapse. They expected to be looking for new jobs by noon. I walked straight to the boardroom, where the senior project managers and the lead accountant, a man named Marcus, who had always looked at me with a mix of pity and annoyance, were waiting. "Alexis," Marcus said, standing up as I entered. "What are you doing here? We're waiting for Vincent. There are some serious discrepancies that need to be addressed immediately. We have contractors threatening to walk off the Mercer Heights site." I didn't sit in my usual chair at the corner of the table. I walked to the head of the room, the seat Vincent had occupied with such unearned arrogance for over a decade. I set my leather portfolio down and looked Marcus directly in the eye. "Vincent isn't coming, Marcus," I said, my voice projecting a calm authority that silenced the room. "And as for the discrepancies, I assume you're talking about the missing $400,000 from the Phase 2 escrow? Or perhaps the consulting fees paid to an LLC that doesn't exist on our organizational chart?" The room went dead silent. Marcus turned a shade of gray that matched my suit. He had known. Maybe not the full extent, but he had looked the other way while Vincent bled the company dry. I have been the primary bookkeeper for this firm since its inception, I continued, opening my portfolio to reveal the verified audit results. I have also, as of yesterday afternoon, been granted emergency executive control of the company by the court, pending the finalization of the asset division. Vincent has been removed from all operational duties. Effective immediately, I am the acting CEO. A murmur rippled through the room. One of the project managers, a man who had spent years ignoring my emails about budget overruns, scoffed. With all due respect, Alexis, you're a wife. You handle the decor and the holiday parties. We have a development to finish. We need a leader, not a bookkeeper. I didn't get angry. I didn't need to. I pulled a tablet from my bag and swiped through a series of spreadsheets. Actually, Jim, what you need is the $3 million in bridge financing that was just pulled because the bank found out Vincent was using the company's line of credit to buy jewelry for his mistress. And what you really need is the signature on the zoning variance for the Heights project, a signature that I secured 4 months ago while Vincent was in Aspen, because I'm the only one who actually read the city council's requirements. I slid the tablet toward him. I know every nail, every brick, and every dollar in this company's history. I've been the one holding the umbrella while Vincent danced in the rain. The dance is over. Now, either you sit down and listen to how we're going to save your jobs, or you can go join Vincent at the unemployment line. He's the one in the lobby in the cheap sunglasses, by the way. The project manager sat down. For the next 4 hours, I did more work than Vincent had done in 4 years. I stabilized the vendors, restructured the immediate debt, and personally called our 3 biggest investors. To them, I wasn't the scorned wife. I was the person who finally gave them a straight answer. I told them the truth, that the company had been mismanaged by a man more interested in his ego than his equity, but that the core assets were sound because I had protected them. By the time I left the boardroom, the staff wasn't whispering in fear anymore. They were working. When I stepped out into the hallway, I saw Lorraine. She was standing by the reception desk, looking like a queen whose palace had just been stormed. She marched toward me, her heels clicking aggressively on the marble. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice vibrating with indignation. "Vincent tells me you've locked him out of his own building. You've humiliated him in front of his employees. Have you no shame, Alexis? After everything this family has done for you." I stopped and looked at her. I thought about the garbage bags. I thought about the 15 years of being treated like a glorified servant. What has this family done for me, Lorraine? You've treated me like a convenience. You've encouraged your son to treat me like a disposable commodity. And now that the bill has come due, you're upset that I'm the one collecting it? You're destroying his life, she wailed, drawing a crowd. He's your husband, the father of your child. He's a man who committed fraud, Lorraine. If his life is being destroyed, it's because he built it on a foundation of lies. I'm just the person who stopped propping up the walls. I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear. And if I were you, I'd check your own accounts. I happen to know Vincent used your retirement fund as collateral for a loan he defaulted on last month. You might want to find a smaller apartment. I hear they're much easier to clean without the help. The look of pure frozen horror on Lorraine's face was the highlight of my week. She didn't have a comeback. For the first time in her life, she was powerless, and she knew it. As I walked to my car, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Vincent. "You think you've won? You're nothing without my name. Everyone will know what a cold-blooded bitch you are." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I just looked up at the Mercer real estate sign on the top of the building. By next month, that sign would be gone. I had already filed the paperwork for the rebrand. It wouldn't be Mercer anymore. It would be Dunst and Associates. The long game was entering its final phase. I had the business, I had the house, and I had the truth. But there was one person left who still didn't fully understand the depth of the betrayal. And that was the person who mattered most. I needed to show Tyler exactly who his father was. Not through my words, but through the evidence Vincent had left behind in his own vanity. I drove home, not to celebrate, but to prepare. The 5 words in the lawyer's office had broken the man. The work in the boardroom had broken the empire. Now it was time to heal the son. The house was quiet when Tyler and I returned, but it wasn't the peaceful quiet of a sanctuary. It was the heavy, expectant silence of a house that had been purged but not yet healed. Tyler went straight to his room, his backpack thudding against the floor, a sound that resonated through the empty hallway. For weeks, he had been a ghost in his own life, caught between the father who promised him the world and the mother who seemed to be tearing it down. He didn't understand the numbers. He didn't understand the audits. All he saw was a family dissolving into a war of lawyers and cold glares. I waited an hour before I knocked on his door. When he didn't answer, I walked in anyway. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at a photo of him and Vincent at a baseball game 3 years ago. In the photo, Vincent looked like a hero. Strong, successful, the man every son wants to be. "He called me, Mom," Tyler said without looking up. His voice was thick with a mixture of anger and grief. "Dad called. He said you're trying to send him to jail. He said you've been planning this for years, just waiting for the right moment to take everything he worked for. He sounds like he's losing it." I sat down in the chair across from him, my heart aching. This was the moment I had dreaded for 3 years. I had wanted to protect him from the truth, but I realized that my silence was becoming Vincent's loudest weapon. As long as Tyler lived in the dark, Vincent could paint whatever monsters he wanted on the walls. "Tyler, look at me," I said softly. When he finally raised his eyes, I saw the confusion of a 15-year-old boy whose world had been flipped upside down. "I haven't been waiting to take what he worked for. I've been waiting for the moment I could stop pretending that he was the man you think he is. I didn't create the fire, Ty. I just stopped being the person who was pouring water on it." "But the business," Tyler started, his voice cracking. "He said he built it for me, for my future." "Then why was he stealing from it?" I asked, setting a laptop down on the bed between us. "Why was he taking the money meant for your college fund and putting it into an account you weren't supposed to know about? Why was he risking your inheritance to pay for a life that had nothing to do with us?" I didn't show him the legal jargon. I showed him the garden spreadsheet, the one I had started 3 years ago. I showed him the dates. I showed him the transfers that happened on his birthdays, on our anniversaries, on the days Vincent had claimed he was working late to provide for us. I showed him the emails Vincent had sent to his secret partners, talking about how he was going to cut the dead weight once the project was finished. Tyler stared at the screen. He wasn't a child anymore. He was smart, and he knew how to read a pattern. He saw the cold, calculated way his father had been building an exit ramp while we were still in the car. "He lied to me," Tyler whispered. The realization didn't come with a shout. It came with a quiet, devastating clarity. "He told me you were the one who wanted to leave. He said you were the one who stopped loving us. I never stopped loving you, Tyler. And I never stopped trying to save what was left of this family. But you can't save someone who is already halfway out the door with the silverware in their pockets. Just as the weight of the truth was settling between us, the front door slammed open downstairs. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. Then came the voice, raw, slurred, and exploding with a desperation that sent a chill down my spine. "Alexis, get down here!" It was Vincent. I could tell by the way he screamed my name that he had been drinking. The king of real estate was gone, replaced by a man who had lost his throne and was now looking for someone to burn. "Stay here," I told Tyler, my voice firm. "Lock the door." "Mom, no!" "Lock it, Tyler, now." I walked down the stairs, each step feeling like a move on a chessboard. Vincent was standing in the foyer, his tie loosened, his expensive suit jacket stained and rumpled. He looked like a man who had been wandering the streets, and, in a way, he had. He had been exiled from his office, his bank accounts, and his reputation. All he had left was his rage. "You think you're so smart," he sneered as I reached the bottom of the stairs. He was swaying slightly, his eyes bloodshot. "You think you can just walk in and take my life? I made you, Alexis. You were a file clerk when I found you. You were nothing." "I was a woman with a future, Vincent," I said, keeping my distance. "You were just the person who convinced me to spend it on you." "I'm going to fight this," he yelled, stepping toward me. "I'll tell the judge you manipulated the books. I'll tell them you're the one who did the transfers. It's your login, isn't it? You were the bookkeeper. I'll bury you, Alexis. I'll make sure you never see a dime, and I'll make sure Tyler hates you for the rest of his life." It was his final, desperate move. The threat of the loyal wife being framed for the husband's crimes. It was a classic play, one I'd seen a dozen times during my years at the law firm. But Vincent had forgotten the most important rule of the long game. Never assume you're the only one recording the conversation. I held up my phone. It had been recording since I heard the front door slam. "Go ahead, Vincent. Keep talking. Tell me more about how you're going to frame me for the money you stole. Tell me more about how you're going to use our son as a pawn. The police are already on their way, and I think the prosecutor would love to hear your exit strategy in your own words." Vincent froze. The bravado evaporated, replaced by a pathetic, hollow terror. He looked around the foyer, the grand entrance to the life he had built on lies, and he realized there was nowhere left to run. He wasn't a king. He wasn't even a villain. He was just a small, selfish man who had finally run out of luck. From the top of the stairs, I heard the click of a door unlocking. Tyler was standing there, looking down at the man he had once called a hero. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The look of pure, cold disappointment in Tyler's eyes was the final blow. The one no lawyer, no audit, and no amount of money could ever fix. Vincent saw his son. He saw the reflection of his own failure in Tyler's face. He didn't yell anymore. He didn't threaten. He just crumpled, sinking onto the bottom step, burying his head in his hands as the distant sirens began to wail. The long game wasn't just about winning. It was about surviving. And as I stood there, watching the police pull into the driveway, I realized that I hadn't just saved my business or my house. I had saved my son from becoming the man sitting on the stairs. The 5 words the lawyer whispered had started the collapse, but it was the truth that had finally cleared the ground. The flashing blue and red lights of the police cruisers painted the walls of our foyer in rhythmic, cold colors. It was a silent disco of disaster. Vincent was led out in handcuffs, not for the fraud, not yet, but for the immediate threat of his drunken, domestic intrusion and the protective order I had filed hours earlier. As the door clicked shut behind them, the house felt cavernous. The silence that followed was different than before. It wasn't the silence of a secret, but the silence of a vacuum. The air was finally clear, but the debris was everywhere. The next 72 hours were a whirlwind of legal maneuvers that would have broken a lesser woman, but I had been forged in the fires of Henderson and Price, and I knew that the moment of a strike is when you must be the most precise. While Vincent sat in a holding cell, waiting for his high-priced lawyer to find a loophole that didn't exist, I was back at the kitchen table. This time, I wasn't making rosemary lamb. I was sitting with Nina Castellano and a federal investigator named Miller. "He's going to try to pin the digital signatures on you, Alexis," Nina said, her eyes scanning the mountain of evidence I had provided. "He's already telling his public defender that you were the one with the passwords. He's going to claim he was a figurehead while you were the mastermind." I leaned back, a cup of black coffee in my hands. I felt remarkably calm. "Let him. I have the keystroke logs. I have the IP addresses from the hotels where he logged in while he was with Brittany. I even have the recordings of him bragging about his offshore genius during the company Christmas party 2 years ago. He thought he was being charming. I knew he was giving me a confession." Investigator Miller looked at me with a newfound respect. "Mrs. Mercer, or should I say Ms. Dunst, you've done more work in 3 years than most of my team does in a decade. Why didn't you come to us sooner?" "Because if I had come to you 3 years ago, he would have had enough liquidity to disappear," I said. "He would have taken our son. He would have hidden the assets in a country without an extradition treaty, and I would have been left with a pile of debt and a broken heart." I had to wait until he was so confident in his own lie that he stopped looking behind him. The criminal case against Vincent began to move with a terrifying speed. The internal audit 5 words were just the tip of the iceberg. Once the federal authorities saw the depth of the wire fraud and the tax evasion, the Mercer empire was treated like a crime scene. But because I had protected the core business, the employees weren't the ones suffering. I had ring-fenced the legitimate side of the company, ensuring that the secretaries, the contractors, and the junior agents still had a paycheck. I wasn't just a wife anymore. I was a lifeline. Then came the confrontation I didn't expect. Lorraine Mercer showed up at my office a week later. She didn't have her stylist, and her perfectly practiced sympathy face was gone, replaced by a raw, jagged desperation. She didn't march in this time. She hovered by the door, looking like a ghost of the woman she used to be. "Alexis," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're taking the house. My house. Vincent used it as collateral for a private loan. I have 30 days to vacate." I didn't feel the surge of spite I thought I would. Looking at her, I only felt a profound sense of exhaustion. "I told you to check your accounts, Lorraine. I told you 3 months ago that he wasn't the man you thought he was. You chose to believe his lies because they were more comfortable than the truth." "He's my son!" she cried. "How could you be so cold? You're a mother too. Think of Tyler." "I am thinking of Tyler," I said, standing up from behind my desk. "I'm thinking of the fact that for 15 years, he watched you treat me like a servant. I'm thinking of the fact that he watched his father lie, cheat, and steal, and he thought that was what success looked like. I'm making sure Tyler knows that being a Mercer isn't a title. It's a debt. and I'm the one paying it off. You have all this money now, Lorraine begged, her pride finally dissolving into a puddle of greed. Surely you can help me, for the sake of the family. The family you tried to pack into garbage bags, Lorraine? I asked. I opened my drawer and pulled out a check. It wasn't for much, but it was enough for a deposit on a modest apartment and 6 months of rent. This is from my personal savings, not the business, not the marital assets, my own money. The money you told me I shouldn't bother having because men have needs. Take it. But if you ever speak to Tyler again and try to poison his mind against the truth, I will make sure the IRS looks into your gifted jewelry collections next. She took the check with shaking hands and left without another word. It was the final tether to the Mercer name, and I felt it snap with a satisfying silence. The public rebranding of the company happened on a Tuesday. I stood in front of the building as the Mercer real estate sign was unbolted from the glass facade. A small crowd of reporters had gathered, lured by the scandal of Vincent's arrest. They wanted a story of a scorned woman seeking revenge. They wanted tears and bitterness. Instead, I gave them a press release. Dunst and Associates isn't a new company, I told the cameras, my voice steady and clear. It is the company that has been operating in the shadows for 15 years. We are not defined by the actions of one man, but by the integrity of the people who actually did the work. We are moving forward with a commitment to transparency, and every dollar we earn will be a dollar accounted for. As I walked back into the lobby, I saw Tyler standing by the elevators. He was wearing a shirt I'd bought him for his first day of a summer internship at the firm. Not in an executive office, but in the records department. He wanted to learn the business from the ground up, the way I had. "How was the speech?" I asked him. He smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "It was good, Mom, but I think you missed a part." "Oh? What part?" "The part where you tell them you're the one who taught the master how to play the game." I laughed, and for the first time in 3 years, the sound didn't feel like a secret. It felt like a foundation. Vincent was facing 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Brittany had disappeared the moment the credit cards were canceled, moving on to the next empire builder who would buy her smoothies until the money ran out. Diane had sent me a long, rambling apology email that I deleted without reading. The long game was nearing its conclusion, but the victory wasn't in the destruction of my enemies. It was in the fact that I was finally standing in a room where I didn't have to whisper. But there was one final detail, a small, hidden piece of the puzzle that even the forensic auditors hadn't found. A secret that Vincent had kept even from his mistress and his mother. And I was the only one who knew where it was hidden. The victory was supposed to feel like a crescendo, a grand symphony of justice and restoration. But in the weeks following Vincent's formal indictment, the feeling was more like a slow, steady clearing of a fog. The Dunst and Associates signs were up. The employees were beginning to trust the new leadership, and Tyler was thriving in the archives, discovering a talent for the same legal precision that had defined my youth. Yet there was a nagging itch at the back of my mind, a detail that didn't fit. I spent my Saturday nights in the quiet of the office, not out of necessity, but out of a habit of vigilance I couldn't quite break. I was looking through the original The Garden spreadsheet, comparing it to the final forensic report issued by the federal investigators. Something was off. The math was perfect. The fraud was accounted for. But there was a 3-week gap in Vincent's digital history from 2 years ago. a period where he had traveled to a small coastal town in Maine under the guise of market research. The auditors had dismissed it as a failed development lead, but I knew Vincent. He didn't do anything for 3 weeks unless there was a trophy at the end of it. I didn't tell Nina. I didn't tell Tyler. I took a Friday off and drove 6 hours north to a town called Bar Harbor. It was a place of rugged cliffs and salt-sprayed air, the kind of place people go to disappear or to start over. I found the address. Not a commercial plot, not a luxury condo, but a small, weather-beaten cottage overlooking the Atlantic. I expected to find another woman. I expected to find a hidden safe of gold bars or a stack of bearer bonds. What I found was a small, hand-painted sign in the window that read, "The Mercer Gallery." I stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming with a hollow, lonely sound. The walls were covered in paintings, vibrant, haunting landscapes of the Maine coast. They were beautiful, filled with a raw emotion that Vincent Mercer, the man of steel and glass, shouldn't have been capable of feeling. An older woman with silver hair and paint-stained fingers walked out from the back. "Can I help you?" she asked, her eyes searching my face. "I'm looking for the owner," I said. "Vincent Mercer." The woman's expression softened into something that looked like pity. "Vincent hasn't been here in months. He's the benefactor. He bought this place and funded the studio for artists who had nowhere else to go. He told me it was the only thing in his life that wasn't for sale." I walked through the gallery, my heart heavy with a confusing new weight. This was the 3-week gap. This was the money that the auditors couldn't find because it hadn't been funneled into an LLC or a luxury car. It had been given away. Vincent had been siphoning the lifeblood out of our marriage, yes, but he had also been trying to buy a soul he had sold long ago. He had created a sanctuary for strangers while making our home a desert. He said he had a wife who wouldn't understand, the woman continued, oblivious to the knife she was twisting in my chest. He said she was too focused on the numbers, on the practicality of life. He said he needed something that didn't have a price tag. I stood in front of a painting of a storm-tossed sea. I realized then that Vincent's greatest crime wasn't the money or the mistress. It was the fact that he had decided I was the enemy of his dreams. He had cast me as the boring bookkeeper, so he could feel like a misunderstood artist. He had stolen from our son's future to fund a legacy that he was too cowardly to share with the woman who actually loved him. He had built this gallery as a monument to his own hidden depth, while I was at home making sure he didn't go bankrupt. He had used my labor to buy his absolution. "Who are you?" the woman asked, finally noticing the way I was clutching my handbag. "I'm the person who paid for this," I said quietly. "I didn't burn the gallery down. I didn't call the feds." I sat on the porch of that cottage for 3 hours, watching the tide come in. I realized that if I added this gallery to the legal settlement, the government would seize it. These artists would lose their home. The paintings would be auctioned off to pay for Vincent's legal fees. In that moment, I had a choice. I could be the woman Vincent thought I was, the woman who saw only the balance sheet. Or I could be the woman I actually was. I called Nina on the drive home. "The Maine trip," I said, my voice steady. "It was a dead end. Just some bad investments in a local startup that went belly up. There's nothing to recover." "Are you sure, Alexis? The timing was suspicious." "I'm sure, Nina. Let it go. We have enough to put him away for a decade. Let's focus on the sentencing." I was closing the garden for good, not because I was forgiving him, but because I refused to let his secrets grow in my life anymore. I wasn't going to let his pathetic attempt at artistic redemption become another item on my to-do list. I left the cottage and the paintings in the Maine fog. They belonged to the man he pretended to be. I belonged to the woman I had fought to become. When I got back to the city, I went to the prison. It was a gray, utilitarian building that smelled of floor wax and regret. I sat behind the glass, waiting for the man who had been my world for 15 years. When he walked in, he looked small. The orange jumpsuit drained the last of the emperor out of him. He picked up the phone, a sneer already forming on his lips. "Come to gloat, Alexis? Come to tell me how the Dunst sign looks on the building?" "No, Vincent," I said. "I came to tell you that I found the cottage in Maine." The sneer vanished. For the first time, I saw genuine, unadulterated shame in his eyes. He didn't have a comeback. He didn't have a lie ready. "I'm leaving it alone," I said. "The artists get to stay. The gallery stays open. But I'm doing it for them, not for you. I wanted you to know that the boring, practical woman you left behind is the only reason your one noble act still exists. You couldn't even be a good person without me subsidizing it." I hung up the phone before he could respond. As I walked out of the visiting room, I felt the last of the bitterness leave me. The long game wasn't just about winning the house or the company. It was about reaching the point where I no longer cared what he thought of me. I walked out into the sunlight where Tyler was waiting in the car. He was playing music, his head bobbing to a beat I didn't recognize, looking forward to the dinner we had planned. I got into the driver's seat, adjusted the mirror, and saw a woman who was no longer a ghost. I was 34 years old. I was the CEO of my own life. And for the first time in 15 years, I didn't have any paperwork to file for anyone else. The final sentencing of Vincent Mercer was not the media circus I had once feared. By the time the court date arrived, the public's short-lived fascination with the real estate rogue had faded, replaced by the next scandal, the next headline. The courtroom was sparsely populated, just a few reporters, the legal teams, and me. I sat in the front row, not out of a need for vengeance, but out of a commitment to witness the final period at the end of a very long sentence. Vincent looked different than he had in the visiting room. He had tried to reclaim some of his old dignity, wearing a suit that now hung loose on his frame. But the spark of arrogance was gone. When the judge read out the charges, conspiracy, wire fraud, tax evasion, Vincent didn't look at me. He looked at the floor, a man finally crushed by the weight of the paper trail I had spent 3 years weaving. 12 years, the judge announced, the gavel striking the wood with a sound that felt like a door locking for the last time. With no possibility of parole for the first 7. As they led him away, he paused for a fraction of a second near my seat. He didn't speak. He didn't sneer. He just looked at me with a hollow, haunted expression, as if he were trying to remember the girl he had met at 17 and realizing he had never actually known the woman she became. Then he was gone. The fallout for the others was less dramatic, but equally absolute. Lorraine Mercer moved into the modest apartment my gift had provided. Without the Mercer name to protect her, her social circle evaporated overnight. The country club set, the very people she had spent her life trying to impress, treated her like a contagion. I heard she eventually took a job at a local library, a quiet, humble end for a woman who once lived to be served. Brittany Sawyer, as I had predicted, didn't stick around for the sentencing. She was spotted months later on a social media feed, posing on a yacht in the Mediterranean with an older tech investor. She was a professional survivor, moving from one host to the next, never realizing that she was just a placeholder in someone else's midlife crisis. And then there was Diane. She reached out one last time, a handwritten letter delivered to my office. It was filled with excuses. I was lonely. He made me feel special. I didn't think it would hurt you. I didn't burn it this time. I simply shredded it. Some betrayals are too deep for fire. They require the slow, mechanical erasure of memory. I didn't hate her anymore. I just didn't recognize her. The company, Dunst and Associates, flourished. It turned out that when you remove the ego of a man who spends half the budget on image, there is a lot of money left over for actual growth. I didn't just manage the books. I expanded the vision. We focused on sustainable development, on building homes that were meant to last rather than just look good in a brochure. My employees didn't call me the boss's wife anymore. They called me Alexis. And for the first time, I felt like I earned the breath I took in that building. A year after the sentencing, I found myself back in that small coastal town in Maine. I hadn't gone back since the day I discovered the gallery. I walked up to the cottage, the salt air stinging my cheeks, and saw that the sign had changed. It no longer said the Mercer Gallery. It was now simply the Horizon. The silver-haired woman was still there. She recognized me immediately and gave me a knowing, gentle smile. "I figured you'd be back," she said. "How is the studio?" I asked. "Thriving," she said, gesturing to the walls. "We've had 3 sold-out shows. An anonymous donor set up a permanent trust to cover the taxes and the maintenance. It's funny, the donor's lawyer said the only condition was that the name Mercer never be spoken on these grounds again." I smiled. Nina had handled the paperwork perfectly. I hadn't destroyed his one noble act. I had just stripped his name from it, ensuring that the beauty remained while the vanity was discarded. I bought a small painting, a simple rendering of a lighthouse standing against a dark, receding storm. I hung it in my office as a reminder that the strongest structures are the ones that survive the night. The most important victory, however, happened at home. Tyler graduated high school with honors and decided to head to university to study forensic accounting. He told me he wanted to be the person who finds the truth in the numbers. We sat on the back deck of our new home, a smaller place, filled with light and books and the things I actually loved, and talked about the future. "Do you ever regret it, Mom?" he asked, looking out at the trees. "The 3 years, the waiting?" I thought about the long game. I thought about the 1,095 nights I had spent reconciling accounts while my husband was with another woman. I thought about the garbage bags and the 5 words that had shattered the man I used to love. "No, Tyler," I said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "I don't regret it. If I had left the moment I found out, I would have been a victim. By waiting, I became the architect. I didn't just get my life back, Ty. I got a better one. I learned that you don't win by screaming. You win by being the person who knows the most about the room they're standing in." The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the lawn. I looked at my son, a young man who knew the value of integrity because he had seen the cost of its absence. I looked at the house that was mine, bought with my own labor and protected by my own wit. 15 years of marriage had been a long, difficult education. But as I sat there in the quiet of my own peace, I realized that the patient wife hadn't been a victim at all. She had been the most dangerous person in the room. My name is Alexis Dunst. I'm 36 years old. I am an entrepreneur, a mother, and a survivor. And for the first time in my life, I'm not waiting for anything. I'm just living. The game is over, and I'm the one who gets to write the final entry in the ledger.